Okay, I guess it's almost time. I think I'm supposed to remind you all to turn off your beeping devices. You know the drill. And I guess we'll get started because it'll be a full hour. All right. Well, first of all, hello. Thank you very much for coming to this session. My name is Jane Ng, and I'm the lead artist at Campo Santo. And today we'll be talking about making the world of Firewatch. So we at Campo Santo spent the last 2 years and some making this game, and we knew from the beginning that it was kind of a crazy idea. We knew that it was going to be tough, even workflow-wise, for a team of more than 10 people to make an open-world-ish game in Unity, let alone one that features a very stylized forest with tons of trees that is supposed to be this big, when we could only realistically maybe draw about this much of the world at any given time. So I know all this is crazy ambitious because I have been doing environment art professionally for over 13 years. And I have made some real open world games before. I was one of the lead world artists on Godfather, which was EA's first open world title back on the PS2. And we had a huge team of over 200 people with a custom engine. And when I joined Double Fine Productions later in my career, I also worked on another open world title, Brutal Legend, this time with only maybe about 60 people, but also with a custom engine. And other games I worked on there include Stacking and The Cave, which actually also featured a contiguous streaming world as well. So I knew when I joined Campo Santo in the fall of 2013 to make Firewatch that I was signing up for a pretty serious challenge. So as I said, we had about maybe 11 to 12 people on the team, and 8 of us are based in San Francisco, 3 are overseas. And we all wear many hats, but about 3 of us are full-time, most directly involved with creating world art assets. So Ollie Moss did the production design, the concepts, a lot of the 2D work, and most of the lighting. Jake Rodkin was in charge of grayboxing the world, level design, a lot of other things, and also 100% of UI, so I guess we get really like half of Jake. And we hired a contract artist to help with some of the human man-made props for about 6 months, and I was the one full-time 3D artist on the team. So not only was I responsible for the 3D environment art in the game, I was also in charge of figuring out our art production pipeline to be as efficient as possible, because all the world art is not just there to look pretty, right? It has to facilitate telling a story in this game. And about that story, Firewatch is a single-player, first-person mystery game set in the Wyoming wilderness in 1989. Where your only emotional lifeline is the person on the other end of a handheld radio. It is a very character-driven adventure game with lots of exploration and interactive dialogue. And now I'm going to show you a quick 1-minute video, which was our trailer at E3.
What's in this cave down here?
NFS tells people not to go too far in there. It's pretty dangerous. You're in it, aren't you?
It doesn't seem that dangerous. Whoa, whoa! Ah, no!
Henry!
Seriously, it's completely fine in here.
Damn it. That storm knocked out the phone line I used to talk to the service, which means we're cut off.
I'll see what I can do.
You think you'll take to it? Being out here? The isolation gets to people. I don't talk to the other lookouts as much as I talk to you. Not in the same way.
What makes me so special?
2 young women have been reported missing. You're probably the last person to have seen them.
Hey, you fucking kids! Somebody cut the comms.
What?
I'm out here and the wire is cut clean through.
Wait, you're already there? You're not in your tower?
No, I'm not.
Then who is?
So I'd say overall, we have been very happy with how the visuals turned out in the game. And these shots I've been showing you are not marketing shots. They are actually just taken by our community of players. And the game ended up being aesthetically very stylized in a way we really wanted it to be, and it also felt real in a way that we wanted. And I really particularly like this player photo because it really feels like someone's actual vacation photo from the 80s, and there's a really cute raccoon in it. So in this upcoming hour, I will talk a bit about how we dealt with the following challenges. So it's kind of the agenda of the day. So how we did concurrent work with Unity with more than 10 people. How we made a contiguous world so there's no pause and load when the player is just traversing the forest. How we made a lot of our foliage and terrain, and how to do world design to make this feel like a natural forest while being structured enough to give the player a sense of progression that also fits in the storytelling. Okay, so first up, how to use Unity with a team of more than 10 people. Now, why is this even an interesting topic? So how to do concurrent work effectively in Unity is actually a very common challenge, a workflow challenge. I suspect this might also be true for other engines. So even though I'll be using Unity terminology here, you should be able to apply the general principles to your own tech pipeline. So first off, what is a scene file in Unity, you ask? A scene file contains all your game objects, your game art, audio, everything that makes up a level. So think of each unique scene file as a unique level. So in a very simple game that has, let's say, 3 levels, you will probably have 3 different scene files. Your entire level 1 would be in, level 1.unity. And if you want to advance to level 2, you have a nice load screen, unload level 1 in the back, load in level 2, and then, you do the same for all the other levels. But what if, so let's say you have 3 people working on this game, and you can easily avoid stepping on each other's work if you just, be in charge of different levels. So that's not a problem. But what if your game only has 1 level? And for Firewatch, we basically have 11 people and 1 large level. So technically, more than 1 person can work on the same scene file at any given time, and you can merge all your changes together in afterwards. But in reality, that's a really, really messy process, and if you have a team of 11 constantly trying to merge changes in together, that's basically impossible. So what other approaches do other people do for this kind of multi-user work? So I asked around, and there seems to be 2 kinds of answers. First one is, we just don't use scene files, as in we don't use Unity as a level editor at all, which is kind of a shame because Unity is actually very powerful as a level editor. But for some games, that makes sense. And the second approach is what I call the rubber ducky approach, as in we take turns editing the main scene file, and we pass a rubber ducky around, and whoever has it gets to touch the main scene file. Or if you have source control, then you have a virtual rubber ducky, and we use Perforce. So you set the scene files to exclusive checkout, and only 1 person can work on that file at any given time. Now for Firewatch, neither of these approaches would work because A, we really need a level editor. B, we have 11 people, and so if you just take turns touching that 1 file, it will take us 11 years to make this game. So the solution is to split up the main scene file into multiple smaller scenes that can then be additively stitched back together as 1 big level when the game is running. So we know that most of the time people only really care about a certain subset of game objects in the scene according to their role. For example, Nels, who is the designer, would really only care about the design-related game objects. And me, as a world artist, I usually just want to touch the trees and rocks, the static world art stuff. And for Ollie, he would probably want to work on a lot of lighting objects all the time. So it makes sense then if we can use a tool to split up the main game scene into smaller per discipline type kind of files that can then be worked on separately. So that's what we did. We gather all our design data to be in one scene, all the world art data to be in their own scene, and then all the lighting data to be in yet another scene. And this enables a lot more people to work together simultaneously, as long as your tool can then stitch everything back when the game is running. So we used a tool, a Unity extension called Sector to do this. It was developed by our friend Nathan Martz, who I worked with at Double Fine. And it is a tool that lets you easily separate chunks of data in your scene into data groups called Sector. And I mentioned this because I'm going to use this term in the later slides, so I want you to know what it is. Each sector can be worked on separately, and they can be additively loaded back into your main level as necessary. In Unity 5.3, though, I know they have introduced a new feature called Scene Manager. I haven't played with it, but supposedly it also enables this kind of work. So if you're looking into doing this stuff right now, definitely check out in 5.3 Scene Manager. Okay, so let's go through a little example. This is a little clip from day one.
It is a hell of a nice camping spot down here by the lake.
I haven't been down there in years, but yeah, Jonesy Lake area is perfect.
So let's say both Nels and I need to work on this part of the game. And for me, I want to move, let's say, a tree around, and I would check out Sector World Art. And if Nels need to adjust where the dialogue happens or need to move the dynamic beer cans around, that is all in Sector General. So he would check that out. And we would all maintain exclusive checkouts of the parts of the scene that we're working on, so we avoid entirely the whole messy issue of merging changes together. And the one other good thing is, let's say I totally screw up and I deleted all the trees in this part of the game, and I need to revert my work. But Nels's changes are entirely untouched, so that's really good. Okay, so once you start splitting up your game data this way, there is really no reason to not really keep splitting them further to fit your specific workflow. So for Firewatch, the game is divided into different days, so it makes sense for us to then further divide our design data into also different days, and we call those subsectors. So in the previous example, that dialogue only happens on day one. So it makes sense that all the data that drives that particular dialogue only exists in day one, and then it doesn't get loaded in any other days. And so it also enables multiple people in design to work on the same sector because they have different subsectors. And for world art, it is split up spatially. So not only that me and Jake can work on different parts of the world. So for example, if I need to move a tree in Teen Zone, and you can go gray box some other part of the world, we are totally working in parallel. We don't touch each other's stuff, which is great. And it also handily facilitates world streaming, which is what we'll get into in the next section. But now, hot tip number one. Absolutely structure your game data to allow for easy concurrent work. So no matter what tool you use or what engine, if you in Unity use your own tool, Sector, Scene Manager, the important takeaway here is that you should really think hard about how to enable your team to work simultaneously instead of one after another. Okay, now we're going to talk about world streaming. So as I said in the beginning, one of the major design tenets of Firewatch is that it is open world-ish. It should exist in one big contiguous world with no pause and load when the player is just traversing the forest or if you're just leaving your cabin. And the only way for Firewatch to be at all performant on any platform is to utilize streaming. Now, streaming is a way of selectively loading in your game assets or stream in data that you need at any point. And scene streaming, world streaming in particular, is about loading in the world around the player that is relevant at that moment. So we use this conference hall as an example, and let's say we are in the white room in floor 2. The only relevant data really is, everyone in this room, all the chairs, the room itself, the doors, and maybe a bit of the hallway outside, so when someone opened the door, it's not like the end of the world. But, floor 1 is really not relevant, if we're all here. And there are different ways to control streaming. So the simplest form is nearby loading or neighbor loading, which is loading purely based on player adjacency. And in this case, if we use neighbor loading, We will probably also be loading the floor below us because it is technically adjacent. Like 10 feet below me, it is floor 1. But that's obviously not very smart because we cannot see floor 1 right now, so it doesn't matter. So a slightly more sophisticated way is to use door and portal streaming, which is basically us telling the game what spaces are connected to each other and in what way. So in this room, we'll tell the game that this room is connected to the door, which is connected to the hallway outside, and you really don't need to load in the escalators and the stairways until you're out in the hallway. And then maybe when you reach the stairway, then you can load the floor underneath. And when you're on floor 1, you can just unload everything on floor 2. So that is a way smarter way of doing this. But what does it mean to do streaming in an open environment like Firewatch? Remember, we already split up the world spatially just into different sectors just so that we can do work concurrently. We can also use this to facilitate world streaming. Well, there are no walls, though, right? There are no doors in the forest. That just means we have to be extra clever. So we kind of made our own doors. So we created this concept of basically using a pair of load and unload volumes to act as kind of like a toggle switch. So let's pretend a little happy face there is our player. And we're currently in a sector Tower Hub. So let's see what happens. Ding! So like the game knows that, oh, you have crossed over this load volume, and I should now load the next relevant sector. And if we change our mind and walk back, the game knows to unload that area. And this is the setup for all that door crazy streaming logic in Firewatch. It got really complicated. The purple volumes are all the load volumes, and the green are all the unload volumes. So every time you walk through, there's actually something happen in the background that hopefully the player will not notice. So in a sense, actually, like, we had to construct the world so to hide a lot of things. And so when we made Firewatch, we actually had to really consider the sight lines of the player at all times. Sometimes we have to add in extra gullies or, make elevation changes just so that when you're passing through one of these doors, that we're actually unloading and loading all the stuff in the back. And if you're just behind this big rock, you just don't see it. But a lot of my work actually was figuring that kind of stuff out. Okay, I'm going to show you a little video of actually how it works in the background in the game. But before I start, I'm going to show you what we'll be looking at. So we will start in Tower Hub at that start point, and then we're going to go west, go through a teen zone, go to the lake, and then do a U-turn and head back east through a canyon back to our tower. So if you play the game, this would be day 1, basically. Right, so what are we looking at here? The left side of the screen is what you see in the editor, the Unity editor. The right side is the player view. And I added a red dot there just to show where the player is. Of course, the player is not actually that big, but the pink part is just your view frustum, so about where you're actually looking at. So we start off at the top of your tower. Then we can see that we're quickly already unloading stuff we don't need. Okay, now, why did we just load now that big chunk of stuff to the north? The reason is, as I said, it's an open world-ish game. So even though in the video the player is heading west, you can actually look to the right and look north, and then there will be a big vista. So that means we actually have to make sure that part of the world exists. And for places like that is just a vista of the world that you don't actually walk to, we use a really low resolution sort of representation of the world. So you can see all the landmarks, but it's actually really cheap geometry. And then once you get to the point that you don't need that anymore, we unload it. Okay. So now the next section just got loaded in, but it looks like only half of the stuff got loaded in, and that's actually intentional. So Teen Zone is the next relevant zone in the game, but we actually further split it into two parts. Because you are, from your tower, you're kind of at the highest point in the game and you're walking downhill towards Teen Zone right now. And so you actually see the tops of the trees and the top of the hills of Teen Zone way before you see all the terrain. So we split up all the trees into one part of Teen Zone, and then all the terrain and all the really low shrubbery and the like tiny detail stuff into another zone. Another sector, I mean. So we load the trees first. So all the stuff actually, you can already see the top of the trees. But we don't need to load in the terrain until way later, which is good, because the less stuff you load, the better performant your game is. Okay, so that's actually when we start loading in the terrain of Teen Zone, and you're really only like 20 meters away. So we cut it pretty close here. There, that's actually Teen Zone. So in the game, you will be rappelling down a rope here, but in the video, I'm totally cheating. But note that we are dropping quite a bit of vertical distance. Okay, so once you're at the bottom of the hill, we just unloaded all that stuff that we were just into because, you know, sightline-wise, once you're at the bottom of that hill, you can't see anything on the top, so we just get rid of it. And we load in the lake already because you can see it. And okay, now this is an interesting spot. So this is right before we do a U-turn to go back east into the canyon. So we deliberately actually funnel the players through a little tunnel here because I needed to know exactly where you are and what you're looking at, because we got to load a whole ton of canyon before you finish completing that U-turn. And seamlessly by now, all that stuff's already loaded in. And then you will notice that we will unload Teen Zone very, very soon. Yep, there we go. Half of it is gone. And then it's all gone. Okay, and the upcoming canyon is a pretty straight hallway, but we still split it up into 4 chunks because it's long enough that you don't actually see all the way to the end. So the end of the hallway right now is currently irrelevant, so we don't load it yet. It's also interesting to note that it is straight, but not super straight, because we do add in little elbows, like right here. I added a little elbow, pretty minor, but that allows me to unload the entire lake area behind you, because you can just turn around and watch it, but the elbow makes sure you don't see it disappear. And here is actually another little wiggle. Yeah. All right, so this part is also interesting, because at the end of this canyon hallway, you're at a T-section. So we're just coming up this way, and then you can actually go, as a player, either go left or go right. In the video, we're going to turn right to the south, but the game has to let you do either, so which means we have to load both the world a bit to the left and a bit to the right. So this was a little bit of a poor performance area before we really had to think about how to structure it a little better. But that's why some of the stuff to the north is also loaded. Now we go through a little cave, and by now I think the game is like, okay, I'm pretty sure you picked this path, which means I can unload all the stuff to the north. So that happened, but it looks like actually a lot more stuff got loaded, but that's actually because we switched out and switched the high res out and load in the lower res, because now you're about to go up on the giant cliff like this, and you kind of go through a path like this, which means even though you didn't pick the path to the north, now you have a grand view of all the world you did not choose to go visit to the north. But that means we instead load in a cheap Vista version. And now we also load in the full res version of Tower Hub, because we know for sure you're heading there, which is where your tower is. There's your tower. And now we get to unload all the canyon in the background. And then you'll see the vista around going to load in. Yeah, so that provides you that really nice 360 vista all around your tower. But it's actually just really cheap geometry. So yeah, so all this crazy stuff is happening in the back, and hopefully you don't really notice. But sometimes sometimes it's hard to hide all of it. So another cool point about doing world streaming is that you can also use this logic to swap out totally different versions of the world given different requirements. So for example, this part of the game we call Ruby River, and it's very lush and green in the beginning, so lush in fact that you cannot actually go through it to go to a different part of the game, so it's totally gated. And in the middle of the game, there is a controlled burn event that conveniently burns everything away. Into this version. So what we do is, so now you can walk through. So now the gating is removed. But to set that up, all we need to do is tell the game, if you're at day, let's say 50 or whatever, below the supposed controlled burn date, 70, then you load the lush version that has the blocker that player can't go through. And if you're on day 70 plus, then we load this version. And you can get really complicated with this stuff. So for the interior of the cabin that Henry lives in, on day 0, it's very clean, it's very empty, and we have 5 versions, I think, of the interior. And by the end, his stuff is just everywhere. He's very messy, and there's undies all over the place. But that's how we do all that switching. Okay, now hot tip number 2. So streaming is not just for big environments. In fact, actually, if you have a game with lots of walls and doors, it is much easier to set up because you actually just have walls and doors. So with the right tools, even a small team like ours can set it up for an open environment. So there's no reason for you to not explore doing this for your own project. All right, let's switch gears and talk about environment art assets. Let's talk about trees. So trees probably take up more than half of the screen during most of the game, so it seems worthwhile to talk about. We started developing Firewatch using Unity 4.5, I believe, and Speed Tree was only introduced in Unity 5, so I never got to evaluate it, because back then our only options were Unity tree created trees or to make our own. And this is Unity tree creator and my beautiful Unity tree. So as you can see there, the Unity tree creator is kind of like a little baby version of Speed Tree, I think. So there's node-based creation tool, and you can just say add a branch and you draw it out. And I think you can make really nice trees with it. I can't. And you can use those immediately and paint it directly onto Unity terrain like airbrush kind of thing. But it's a little limited because as you can see here, there's no random rotation in the placement, and you can't tell it to tilt or have any sort of scale thing. I mean, there's a reason for it because it billboards very efficiently, but for us, we feel like that's a little too limiting. So we decided to make our own trees. So this is the lineup for all the 23 different trees we made for the game. Though 9 of those, all the ones on the bottom row, the aspens and the cottonwood trees, were really only uniquely placed in a couple of areas. So the top 14 trees are the sort of stars of the game. They're everywhere in the game. Most of the game is made with those 14 trees. And I counted, well, I didn't count, but we made a tally, and we have about 4,600 tree placements in the game, I think, not counting all the billboards that we use for faraway vistas. So there was a lot of copying and pasting going on in Firewatch. That's kind of my philosophy, actually, just to make a few really good modules and just instance the crap out of them because they wouldn't really notice. Now we're going to pick one of these. Pine C, one of my favorites, and we'll go through a little bit of an asset breakdown. Okay, so here on the left side, you have the tree in Maya view, and then the middle is what it looks like in Unity, and on the right side is just textures that we used. So you have a tree trunk, and we have little broken branch nubs on the bottom, actual geometry branches, some more detailed sort of leaf puffs that are more sort of 3D, and then the rest of the tree are just very cheap leaf carts. Now, why is there all the detail on the bottom? Because Henry's actually this tiny. Real trees are really big, and these are all actually kind of realistically sized trees. And this is one of our smaller trees. Okay. And here we have Pine C's LOD lineup. And this is about at a medium setting on the PC. A quick note is that in Unity, there is a variable called LOD bias, which is a multiplier on this kind of definition, which is what we use to modify sort of different LOD definitions per quality level. So for a setting for a high-end PC, it's about double of that, something. But and I'll note it's this, LODs are not actually distance-based, it's screen size-based, I believe. One interesting thing to note here is that LOD2 and LOD1 is actually not that different in terms of try count. The main difference actually is that LOD2 has way fewer shadow casting geometry. And for trees in particular, that's something you really have to pay attention to if you're making your own LODs. Like the amount of shadow casting geo can really affect performance. And I have a little video showing the transition. And you don't really notice, so I was quite happy with this one. I know that there are middleware out there like Simplicon that does automatic LOD generation, which I've heard great things about. But for a game like Firewatch, when my philosophy is to just have less than 24 models to begin with, and the highest LOD is not that expensive, it was just easier for me to hand make all the LODs instead of learning a whole new tool. But I think if you have lots of like NPCs or something, that's probably worth looking into. And another note is that we did not use any LOD crossfading for our trees. The reason being, I prefer just making the transition well instead of relying on crossfading, because if you're crossfading, you actually have to draw both LODs when you're crossfading. That means your draw call can like be suddenly really high. And for us, with a game with so many trees, draw call was already kind of a problem. So we don't do it. Okay, so that covers about the geometry part of the tree. Now let's talk quickly about the custom shader that we made. Last year, I talked more about this in detail, that Ollie in his art direction really wanted our tree shapes to get more stylized and more simplified as they are further away. So more kind of like graphic art look when the trees are further out in the distance. So in our shader, we push out, we actually push the number-wise, the alpha cutoff number is lower when the tree is further away. So like, if the tree is further away, it's more puffy looking, like the tree on the right. Alpha cutoff is just Unity's way of determining where in the threshold it determines your binary alpha. So just a really simple way, really cheap way to get the look we want that is just automatic. And another thing we added to our custom shader is custom tree wind response. Because as we all know, like trees are not like lampposts, right? It has to move a little. And for us, since we're making our own trees, we have to figure that out. I learned the system in using Brutal Legend while I was making Brutal Legend. And this is all just vertex animation in the shader. And my job as the artist is to just define the vertex color for the tree. So red is vertical sway like this. And so the top of the tree is the most red, bottom is no red. And green is what I call branch flap movement, which is like this. So the most green is the end of the branch, and the part where it attaches to the tree trunk has no green. And blue is leaf flutter, which is like this. So if my fingers are the leaves, like fingertips, most blue, and then no blue where it's attached to the branch. So it's very simple to author. And I think it works pretty well. So this little video shows, just very low ambient movement. And you don't need a lot just to show that the tree's alive. And then when you crank it up, it feels very windy. So that worked well for us. Now, hot tip number 3. So artists like to make art, no question about that, but don't just make tons of models because it's fun. The more models you make, the more maintenance you actually have to do. So if you can get away with 23 trees, don't make 25 trees. Okay, now let's talk a bit about terrain. Quite a few people have asked us how we manage the terrain. We use Unity terrain, and it's quite easy to work with because you can just easily make a terrain, sculpt a bit, just paint down some terrain textures and grasses, and your player can immediately walk on it, and it's functional. In that sense, it was great. However, there are quite a few things you should watch out for if you want to use this as your in-game asset. Oh, forgot to click through. So that's actually what the naked terrain looks like. Okay, a few issues. Number 1, the terrain texture by default is, here. Terrain texture is top-down projected, which means if you have a lot of steep cliffs, UV stretching is a big problem, as you can tell there. It's pretty bad. We tried adding our own box projection for terrain texture projection, but it just got really expensive because you have to draw the terrain twice, all that. So we decided to just work around it by layering rock meshes on top, which works great, but it's very labor intensive. And the second issue is that the grasses are actually more expensive than you might think. So Unity grass, like all aspects of the terrain, is very easy to use. You just define a few sprites, and you have a parameter that you can set the size and the color, and you can paint it on immediately. However, it's not quite clear how the different setting affects performance. I worked with it for 2 years, and I still don't really know, to be honest. We discovered very late in development that this setting, the detail map resolution setting, has a huge impact on performance. I had an area go from maybe 40 frames per second, jump to like 80 frames per second just by changing that map resolution, even though the visual density of the grass cards seem to be the same. And the problem is every time you change some of the terrain settings, it blows away all the grass painting. So I think that was part of the reason why we never figured it out until the very end, because it was just really hard to experiment with. And the third point is terrain shadow cost. So Unity terrain tessellation does not really take into account the curvature of the terrain. So if you don't want very crunchy hills, your tessellation cannot be too low. However, Unity also uses the visual mesh to do shadow calculation, I think. So this could lead to quite expensive shadow calculation time, which means that we ultimately actually turn off the terrain shadow casting and made our own proxy shadow mesh for the terrain, which is also quite labor intensive. So in conclusion, I think we made a right call creating our own trees. And I think if I could rewind time, I would have suggested a more customized solution for our terrain as well. I think ideally we would use Unity terrain as the editing, to use it for just editing. And then when on export, we would just automatically make a mesh that is a little more suited for our purpose. Okay, hot tip number 4. So this might seem obvious, but definitely do a performance capture earlier rather than later, just to see what might potentially be a problem. So I think we underestimated the challenge of optimizing our terrain until we were past the point of doing something custom about it. But normally I'm usually pretty happy not doing art optimization too early, but I think that kind of caught us by surprise. Okay, we are at our last segment. Let's talk about some lessons learned while doing world design for Firewatch. So the world design in Firewatch has to achieve two goals. It is a narrative game, so level design has to guide the player from story point to story point without too much hand-holding. People shouldn't get too lost. And the world has to feel like a big, interesting forest to explore, while not being so big that we can't actually make it in under 2 years. So we started by designing the world as the story was being developed. The goal here is that each area in the game serves a narrative purpose, because we're not just making a forest just to have a pretty forest. Like, it has to be very goal-oriented. And we just started with paper maps. At this point, it is mostly an intellectual exercise to sort of force you to think through, if your story needs this area, can you even actually fit it into an area that is around Henry's tower? Because, he lives in a tower, he can't actually walk that far. So if you can't make this work on paper, there's really no way we would be able to wing it in 3D. We ended up switching a lot of areas around, but just the fact that we already noted all the things we needed in the beginning was very helpful. And so while Jake and the story folks are figuring that kind of paper map out, Ollie is doing some visual development alongside everyone. So there's kind of two types of visual development. The first type is just kind of generic, beautiful areas that we could include in the game. They're not specifically tied to any story moment. And then there's also very specific concepts for very specific story moments. And so everyone doing this together was very helpful, because the paper map, the level design map thing, and the story and the visual development all inform and inspire each other. So when they have a very tight iterative loop, it's great. However, even though we have a good bunch of concept art and a nice paper map, it doesn't just equal a 3D space. So we need to figure out how big that world actually is and answer questions like, how long does it take for Henry to walk from one end to another? We don't know. So the traditional way of figuring that kind of problem out is by utilizing a process called gray boxing or white boxing. There are other terms for it. We call it gray boxing. So you literally just mark out your space with very simple, minimal objects that you don't have to spend any time to make, like cubes. So we just use cubes and plop down everywhere. But gray boxing just didn't quite work for us because, look at this. Do you know what you're looking at? You know how big anything is? What is the story here? Now imagine walking from point A to point B with some nice subtitle writing. Even if it's the best writing, I guarantee you if you spend 2 minutes walking from point A to point B, it will be the most boring 2 minutes of your life. This just doesn't really do anything for you. And that is obviously a big problem, because the entirety of Firewatch is supposed to be about walking through a beautiful space, having interesting conversation. But with a gray box, we couldn't tell if it was going to be beautiful. We couldn't tell if the walking and talking is interesting at all in that space. It answered 0 questions. So we needed a different way to evaluate if the core of the game, like the whole conceit of the game design, is even fun. So to test our idea out, we decided, you know what, we just really needed to do a vertical slice of the game. And, we just picked, let's say, day 1. That's what we decided. Day 1, we need to make it into a vertical slice. and push everything to basically be almost shippable quality, like at least very representative of what you don't mind shipping. With good art and professional voice acting, and every system that you want in the game, just to be able to judge if this is actually even a good idea. But the problem is doing a true vertical slice, even if you're, let's say, making just 10% of the game, it means everything you need to make the game has to be functional. So all your tools, all your processes has to be made to get even that 10% to happen. And for us, that took 15 months. And remember, we wanted to ship the game in 2 years, so that was kind of scary. But at least at the end of 15 months, we had something that we were confident with, that we showed the public hands-on to see what everyone felt. And that was actually last GDC. So the secret here is that last GDC, when we showed off the game, we showed everything we had. We had nothing else made. And for the world art, let's see, come on. It was really scary for me because that was actually just about 1/3 of the game, of the world that we wanted to make. So it was pretty stressful. But it was not a disaster because at least with that vertical slice, we know walking and talking actually is fun. And that we could make the world to be fun to be explored. And that people enjoy navigating from landmark to landmark. And that if you tie story moments to specific world art landmarks, that the payoff is actually kind of great. So we learned that also people don't really care the actual sort of distance traveled, as in no one ever goes, oh, go 200 meters that way is better than going 300 meters. People just navigate by, or they remember your game experience by interesting spot to interesting spot. So that told us that maybe we should just start identifying out cool landmarks for the rest of the game, which is what we did. So we picked a bunch of all these cool, generic, sort of cool environments we want in the game, and developed them into cool story landmarks to start anchoring spaces in that map. So for example, this waterfall became a story area in the game in day 2. And then we scrapped gray boxing entirely and switched to just marking out where the landmarks are. That's because we also had no time to do the whole gray boxing anymore. We're just, okay, I'm just going to first art pass everything with the landmarks. So as you can see here, the stream is just blue painted on the terrain, and the trees are just one type of tree everywhere. But at least this actually gives you enough information to have some sort of emotional response to the space. And with some lighting, it actually is enough. And to show you what it looks like in the end, it actually didn't change too much. So it was working. Here's another concept area, which was very quickly turned into first pass art. Which is now, this is the final part of the game. Final art, I meant. And more concept. To super quick first pass art. I think that's just actually literally an orange cube turned sideways. And that's the final art. But again, it really didn't change that much because it gave us the information we needed to evaluate. So once you have all those cool story landmarks marked out in the map or in your actual game world, then the world design problem becomes more straightforward, right? It just becomes filling in all the in-between areas to make it more interesting. But that is a way more straightforward problem because we have a few things we could do. Number one is that we have all those cool concept art that we can draw from. So we knew that we wanted to put Aspen Grove somewhere in the game. So now, why not this in-between area? And you can also add discoverables along the way, and also objects that have that we know already have dialogue attached to it to extra spice things up. Now I'm going to show you a clip from the game with some notes that will pop up to show why why we think it's actually a good space. So this is an area between a rope anchor and the teen camp area, which is like an area in day 2. And it is one of the biggest in-between spaces in the world. In the beginning, I was really worried because I was like, oh crap, I think I put the waterfall way too far. And I was convinced I had to pull that in, and I was a little worried. But actually, at the end, it turned out to be, I think, one of the most successful parts of the game. And yeah, and I think we managed to put enough stuff, like every 20 seconds or so, for the player to either it's new for the player to see or to do, that it made the area really fun.
How many hikers go missing in the Shoshone?
More than none, unfortunately, with most of them being in this area. The thoroughfare because it's so remote. Why?
I found an old flyer for a missing hiker. It just got me thinking, that's all. Like how you said one day you were talking to the Goodwins and then the next you weren't.
Ned Goodwin didn't get mauled by a bear or stuck in a ravine. He was just a PTSD'd a-hole who dragged his son out to do a job and realized it was a bad idea.
What, grizzlies won't kill an a-hole? They don't have a taste for unapologetic pricks?
Nope. It's why we haven't lost a ranger in 11 years.
So, you don't think anything bad happened to those guys?
Yeah, I guess it's possible, but we usually find evidence of stuff like that. For instance, if you were to be hunted down and torn to shreds, I'm sure someone would come across a bloody beard and shredded pair of ugly cargo shorts.
I like these shorts.
I'm sure you do, Henry.
Boy, for as dry as it is this summer, there's an area down here that's lush.
Oh, you must be talking about the Aspen Grove down there.
Yeah, I think that's where I am.
Those trees are actually one root organism. Did you know that?
I didn't.
Yeah, they share their water as a colony that can live for hundreds of years, even through fire. Can you believe you're actually getting paid to learn all of these amazing things? Also, by what it looks like on this map, you'll be coming up on a stream that should lead you towards where we saw that smoke.
Found one of their empties. Guess we're on the right track.
Roger that.
It's a really nice waterfall down here. Given those girls love a skinny dipping, I bet they're nearby. There's some cloth out here. It looks like it was torn from something.
Strange.
I'll keep looking around.
Right now is my last hot tip for you all, which is actually the most important takeaway. So, part of the illusion of this type of GDC talk is that I'm supposed to make us sound like we really knew what we were doing the whole time. But the reality really was more like this. That everything always felt like it was just on fire, especially in the last third of production. Making games is just really hard. It doesn't matter if you're very experienced. If you're even trying to do one new thing, it is going to feel like you're a total newbie all over. So I would say even if you, at the very end, are very proud of your work, and for us, we're really proud of Firewatch, you just don't know that at all when you're in the middle of it. So don't be too discouraged if you feel this way. And it always feels like nothing is working until magically one day it just does. So thank you very much for coming. And so I actually think we have maybe 5 minutes for questions. And if not, if you're too shy, I'll be out in the wrap-up room as well, and that's my contact info. And there are a couple of microphones in the aisle, so walk up and ask questions if you have any.
Hi.
Hi.
So I noticed there's no NPC or animals except for that turtle in the game. Was that like a production decision or art decision or something else or story decision?
Yes, I think the thing is like I think in the very beginning we knew we only have so much resources, and Sean and Jake came from making Walking Dead, and so they knew how expensive it really is to have any NPC, right? Especially if it's an NPC you can see. It's just, we don't have that kind of money. So we basically thought about how, if the important part of this game is interacting through dialogue, do you actually really need to see anybody? So that's kind of so that was very intentional from the very beginning that was one of the things that we wanted to do. In terms of more animals and stuff, I think we always wanted to add more animals, but every time we do, like the turtle, it seemed really simple to add, but we had so many bugs associated with the turtle. But I secretly want more raccoons in the game. But yeah, it's really kind of like a practical thing. But those birds, we got those birds from the Unity store for I think $10. So Unity store is great. I actually was just looking for just a well-made bird for $10, but it came with a whole flocking system for $10. I think it's now smartly at $15 because I would have paid way more for that. But anyway.
Thank you.
Hi.
Hello. I'm glad you talked about the whole scene segmentation system. That was really interesting. But it made me wonder, how do you maintain continuity between all these sections that you're editing separately? Do you have a system that does that automatically, or is it all just manual and gross?
It's just gross manual stuff, really. So the segments actually can be loaded together in your main scene. So I do that when I'm working on, let's say, just one part. I do load all the stuff next to it. And I think I got a Unity extension called something like Terrain Stitch or whatever to just make sure my terrain pieces actually match. But, if you do import in the stuff on the side to be a reference point, then I just hide. I mean, the thing is the sections are not you're not cutting a cake. You can have a rock overlapping to the next part and it doesn't matter. So I hide a lot of seams with rocks and stuff. Hide things with rocks. Another hot tip. Okay, we're going to do one more question.
I'll keep it short. You mentioned that in the beginning you guys knew that it was absolutely insane that you wanted to do this huge world. What pushed you to do it? What was your big motivating factor?
I think we're all a little crazy, maybe. I don't know. I think we happen to just have a group of people who were all kind of experienced in the industry, and we've all done sort of bigger games, and I think most of us have worked on bigger games before. And just when you get all the team together and you all see this person said yes, this person said yes, so I'm a little afraid, but I think we can all try to do it. But we were all very realistic from the beginning that what's the worst that could happen, right? The worst is that we try, we end up hating each other, this doesn't ever get shipped, and we all just get jobs. But at least you would have tried it. I think we were just all in that spot in our career that we were willing to take a risk, and we were lucky enough to just have a group of people that all kind of be okay, it is scary. Nobody's pretending that it's not scary, but if we all try together, that we may. This is the only chance, I guess, that we'll try to get it to work, kind of thing.
Thank you very much.
All right. Well, thank you again. I think it's time for me to move to the wrap-up room.